Today on Passion for Food, we're going to be making these Philly cheesesteak baked buns. On the outside, they just look like perfect little hamburger buns, but on the inside, we have this beautiful Philly cheesesteak filling. I'll show you how to put all of this together, and we'll talk briefly about the history of the Philly cheesesteak sandwich. And, of course, the rare steak joke or two. Now, let's go ahead and get started. And first up here is our steak. Now, I don't think it matters hugely what kind of steak you use, but the one thing I would suggest is leaving it mostly frozen before you cut it. And I know this is probably going to trigger some folks, but I'm actually going to cut this layer of fat off of mine first before I slice it up. If you like the fat, definitely leave it on there, but me and my wife just don't like biting down on pieces of fat, so the fat goes. As for this little scrap piece, don't worry, we're not going to waste that. I'll either wind up feeding that to my dogs or turning it into ground beef later. Okay, so let's go ahead and get slicing, and what we want to do here is cut this basically as thinly as we can. This is made a lot easier by the fact that these steaks are still mostly frozen. If you have some thawed steaks, I'd recommend popping them into the freezer for at least an hour before you slice them. But while I finish slicing up 2 of these New York strip steaks, let's take just a moment and talk about the history of the Philly cheesesteak. You see, between 1870 and 1930, the Americas saw an influx of Italian immigrants, mostly because of political upheavals back home. And as legend has it, in the 1930s, Pat Olivieri was running a small food stand in Philadelphia. They sold mostly hot dogs and fish cakes. One day, having grown tired of eating his own limited menu, he sent his brother Harry to a local butcher. Harry came back with some thinly sliced ribeye, which Pat cooked up with some sliced onions and slapped onto a roll. The story goes that a passing cab driver, smelling the sandwich, requested his own. And it must have been good, because before long, cab drivers from all over the city were stopping by Pat's for their own steak sandwiches. By the 1940s, Pat had saved up enough money to open his own restaurant, which he named Pat's King of Steaks. The addition of cheese is a little more controversial, but most credit that to Pat's manager, Joe Lorenza, in the 1940s. Although some credit that to Joey Vento, who opened a rival restaurant, Gino's Steaks, right across the street from Pat's. This is of course hotly debated, but a strong rivalry exists between the two restaurants to this day. But whoever first started putting cheese on it, I definitely think it would be a mistake not to. Anyway, now that we have our meat all sliced up, I'm going to go ahead and season this while it's still frozen. The main reason I do that is the pieces of meat just slide around against each other much easier when they're frozen, so it's easier to distribute that seasoning evenly between the pieces. You can see I like quite a lot of fresh cracked pepper on mine, but you can use however much or as little as you would like. Along with a teaspoon or so of salt, and then I'm just going to mix this all around to get our seasonings distributed all throughout the meat. Once we're happy with this, we do want to let the meat sit and thaw completely before we try and cook it. Once we're nicely thawed, it's time to whisk this off to our pan. Now, what kind of pan? Well, you should use the biggest pan you have. I'm going to use my wok here today. If you had a flat top, that would be ideal. Now, while this is cooking, I'm going to go ahead and chop in 1 large onion. Now, this is optional and a little controversial, but I am going to go ahead and chop in a good handful of mushrooms here. Just leave these out if you don't like them. I like to let that steak cook over very high heat for at least a minute or 2 before we start stirring this around. That just gives it an opportunity to develop a little bit of browning. We want to continue frying up our steak and onions until our steak is cooked through and the onions have just started to turn translucent. And because we let that sit for a minute before we started mixing it up, you can see we've actually developed a nice brown crust on some of our steak. That's exactly what we're looking for right there. But instead of just slapping this on a 2-day-old stale bun from the store, let me show you how to make the dough we're going to use to turn these into beautiful Philly cheesesteak baked buns. This dough just couldn't be simpler. I use it for this and a whole bunch of other stuff, and we just start with 2 cups of all-purpose flour, along with about 1 tablespoon of sugar, 1 teaspoon of salt, and approximately 1 tablespoon of fast-acting yeast. This is like instant bread machine yeast. And then I'm just going to give that a quick mix around for no apparent reason, and then we're going to add about 1 tablespoon of melted butter. And the last thing we need is 3/4 of a cup of very warm water. Think just slightly warmer than bath water. We don't want it to be boiling or it might kill the yeast. And to get this mixed, the best tool is at the end of your arm. It's your hand. You're gonna wind up needing this anyway, so you might as well just get in there and get your hands dirty now. You'll notice I reserved a little bit of the water just to make sure I wasn't gonna make the dough too wet, but it turns out I needed all 3/4 of a cup. We just want to work this together with our hands until it comes together into a nice dough ball for us, at which point we're just gonna knead this for about 5 minutes or so. Now, trust me, I know how tempting it is to skip the kneading part, but it really does need it, dough. You see, the kneading helps develop the gluten, which are essentially wheat proteins that give the dough its characteristic stretch. If you skip the kneading, it winds up more like biscuit dough, and when we go to try and stretch it around our filling, we're going to get tearing instead of stretching, and that's just no fun. Anyway, once our dough is done being so kneady, we're just going to coat it lightly in oil before covering and setting this in a warm place to rise for about 30 minutes. Once our dough ball has approximately doubled in size, we're going to go ahead and pull it out of here and just give it another quick kneading. That just helps knock out all the bigger air bubbles to make it easier to form into our Philly cheesesteak baked buns. And we want to go ahead and cut this into about 8 or so equal pieces. And it's a good idea while we're working with one piece, we want to cover the other pieces in a damp kitchen towel. Here we have our mostly cooled Philly cheesesteak filling ready to go, so let's go ahead and form this. I like to start out with my hands, just form it into a rough circle. We can form these completely by hand if we want, but once I have a rough circle shape, I find it goes a little quicker if I switch to a rolling pin to get it rolled out the rest of the way. Once we have that nice and flat, it's time to assemble. Now, I usually like provolone with mine, but today I decided to try using these American single-style cheeses, and I'm just going to fold up the corners to make that a little smaller, right in the middle here. That's kind of a nod to the Cheese Whiz, which is traditional in so many Philly cheesesteak recipes. And now we just want to add about 1/8 of our steak and onions mixture. And we just want to get this dough sealed up around our filling. And this is not necessarily going to be pretty, and don't worry, it doesn't need to be pretty, because this is actually going to get a second proofing. Now, what I should have done is measure out that filling ahead of time, because you'll notice I wound up with 7 buns and one like a roll. Yeah, okay, maybe we meant to do that. Anyway, one final thing I like to do before giving this a second rise is I'm going to go ahead and egg wash it. A lot of people like to do the egg washing right before it goes into the oven, but I find if I let these rise a second time and then egg wash them, it's way too easy to accidentally deflate them. So I think it works a lot better egg washing them before that second rise. And I'm also going to toss a couple of sesame seeds on top here. I think that's just a classic look, and they also add a nice little nutty flavor once they're cooked. Anyway, now that I've seeded that idea, we want to go ahead and cover this and let it rise again for about 30 minutes. Once they're nicely puffed up like this, there's one final addition I like just to make them a little special, and that is some of this coarse sea salt. That'll add just a little great salty crunch on top. People won't necessarily be expecting, but they're gonna love it. Once we're happy, we just want to whisk this off to a preheated 400-degree oven where they're going to cook for about 15 to 20 minutes or until they're golden brown. At which point we can go ahead and pull these out, and it would probably be smart to let them cool for 5 minutes or so, but I'm not going to. I'm going to go ahead and grab one and give it a try. And you can see here what I meant about the bottom of these. It's all fused together when it had that second rise, so you don't even have to stress out too badly about sealing the bottoms of these. Anyway, let's go ahead and cut one of these in half and reveal that Philly cheesesteak magic on the inside. Those American cheese singles really worked excellently here. I love how it kind of melted and fused down with all the steak just beautifully. I really loved how these turned out, so I hope you give them a try soon. I really hope you've enjoyed today's episode of Passion for Food. If you have, give me a thumbs up below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit that little bell so you don't miss our future recipes. And check out one of our other great videos playing on the screen now. This has been Graham with Passion for Food.